Hello, folks. I want to do a couple videos for you on diversity before we move into looking at all these different groups. And as we start thinking about all these different groups of organisms on the planet, we have to go in with a context for how we organize that diversity and how we think about how organisms are related to each other. Because what we uh, believe based on analysis of genetic material is that everything on Earth is related to each other, that at some point in the past we all shared a common ancestor with each other. So as we talk about all these different groups, we want to do that in the context of thinking about how they're all related to each other and what is the tools that we use to reconstruct those evolutionary relationships, or what are the models that we use to think about evolutionary relationships. So this is all about how do we create evolutionary trees. And we have to think first about, and so one of our outcomes is differentiating between the naming of things, which is taxonomy, just giving things names, and constructing evolutionary trees that tell us about how organisms are related to each other. That's cladistics. And then we're going to take a long look and continue to do it for the rest of the quarter at evolutionary trees and read those evolutionary trees and learn how to construct those evolutionary trees. So constructing cladograms and reading cladograms. We'll also talk about phylogenies that are very closely related. Both of these are just basically diagrams of evolutionary relationships. And then we're going to talk about the the ways, the evidence that we use to reconstruct evolutionary trees or cladograms. Okay, so classification or taxonomy, it's just the naming of things. So we classify things, and you probably classify things all the time, maybe without thinking about it, and you give names to things. So it's a very natural thing for us to do as humans. Like if I were to say, okay, classify these writing utensils, and I threw a bunch of things at you, you would very quickly and without too much thought sort them into pens, markers, pencils, crayons, whatever, chalk, right? And so then if I ask you, well, why did you sort them in that way? And why did you give them those names, right? You would be able to tell me the sort of mental construct you had for doing it. So just the naming of things is a very natural thing to do. And you can probably look at all these animals here. And if I said, what group do these animals belong to? You'd probably all say, well, they're mammals because they have fur, right? That would be like maybe the easiest thing to point to. But then if I said, well, which ones are most closely related to each other? Then that might get a little harder, and maybe you wouldn't know, but you would start to pick out features, traits. You would start to pick out phenotypes that you thought indicated that they were more closely related. Like you might say this and this are close relatives. They are. This is a gray wolf, and this is actually a hybrid between a gray wolf and a coyote called a red wolf. Um, and then who's most closely related to these two? Um, Maybe you'd say the fox, right? Well, fox kind of looks similar, right? He's got this big bushy fur, long pointed snout, these triangle shaped ears, right? And then who's most closely related to those? Um, and you would go work your way backward. And that's essentially what we do when we create evolutionary trees, is we find traits that we think are important or that we think tell us who's most closely related to who. We pick traits that we think indicate close relationship to each other, right? And so if we had to reconstruct this tree, we'd have these two are each other's closest relative, then this fox, and then the next most closely related is actually this cougar, right? And then going out from there is the last carnivore here, which is this meerkat, right? And then even further out, we'd get this other placental mammal. These are all placental mammals, the kangaroo rat, and finally the most distantly related would be this kangaroo, which is a type of marsupial, one of the three different major groups of mammals, a marsupial. Um, so you may or may not know that, but that's not important. Important is to think about how you come up with ways to name things, to give things names, how to classify them, and that's really all that uh, we do to create evolutionary histories as well, is to find traits that we think indicate close relationship. And that's sort of the hard part and the key is which traits indicate close relationship. Right? So early on, there were different efforts to name organisms and organize the diversity of life on Earth. But early on, um, people were still doing it with the idea that things had been created as we see them now, and they hadn't changed over time. So it assumed that life is static and unchanging over time, and therefore we could put things into hierarchical categories. And people place things into hierarchical categories um, in the way that they think sort of are the creator of or of the world had wanted them to be. So this was all inferential, of course, and a lot of it was just guesswork, but hierarchical classification was a nice advance that we came up that Carolus Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist, came up with. It is based, unfortunately, on this ideal of static uh, organisms, that they don't change, they don't evolve or mutate over time. And of course, we know that's not how things are now, but at least it gave us a categorization scheme. And you might know this categorization scheme that he came up with, the largest being kingdom, and then smaller phylum, class, order, family, genus, and finally species being the smallest grouping of organisms you could come up with. And he also came up with this idea that everything is going to get two names. Every organism is going to get two names that we call it by, and those two names are, there will never be any two names that are exactly the same that indicate a different organism, for example. So everything gets a genus and species name, and we're going to refer to everything by those two names and two names only. So we are Homo sapiens, right? Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species. And it was a nice thing because it replaced like there were lots of polynomials out there where, oh, this fungus has four names and this plant over here has three names, right? And he said, no, 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 we need some uniformity here. Everything is going to have exactly two names. Okay, so that was a great attempt at naming things, taxonomy, giving it a name. Right? But this system doesn't account for evolution, right? This just is based on the scheme that, or this scheme comes from the perception, or is based on the conception that um, organisms aren't changing over time. So all we have to do is find who looks the most similar overall, and we'll probably be right in saying that they're closely related to each other. Darwin, of course, kind of threw a wrench in that, and others who came before and others who followed him. He's just the most famous in that he argued that life is dynamic and that organisms change over time, just as the Earth changes over time, and mountains are built and erode, and there are volcanoes, build mountains and cut land and do all sorts of things, and that the species who live uh, in those places must be affected by these geological processes and must also change. And so that the naming scheme that comes from this conception that things change over time, that life is dynamic, is based on, well, we have to figure out who's most closely related to each other, right? It's based on the idea that everything is related. So we have to uncover those ancestral relationships. We have to discover those. Um, and often that is reflected in how similar things look to each other, but sometimes it isn't. And that's where we can run into trouble. And so we have to have some system that we use in order to infer who's most closely related to each other, in order to infer ancestral relationships, right? So we use a system where we base our groupings of organisms on whether traits that are shared among the organisms and that are so all the organisms have it, and that are homologous. Homologous means that we can we that the trait evolved in an ancestor of all these organisms and not in each organism separately or independently. And that's sort of the tough part, right? But if you figure that out, then you can say, well, look, probably then that if homologous traits mean that these organisms had a most recent common ancestor, or sorry, shared an ancestor fairly recently. If they all look really similar, they all have similar traits, and those traits evolved in the ancestor, then they're probably really closely related to each other. So homologous just means a trait that is shared by two or more groups of organisms because their common ancestor evolved that trait. There's an alternative too, right? Like there are traits could be analogous rather than homologous. That just means the opposite of homologous, that two or more organisms share a trait, not because it evolved in their common ancestor and persisted in both of those organisms, but because it evolved independently in each of those lineages of organisms, right? So an example of a homologous trait is here in these rodents. This is one of a species of rodents called pocket gophers. There are lots of pocket gophers that burrow under the soil. This is one species of kangaroo rat. Kangaroo rats are desert rodents. And you actually saw a picture of a kangaroo rat earlier on the first slide, that cute little guy with short little arms. So both of these have fur-lined cheek pouches. They're outside their cheeks. And you can see here there's some oats coming out of this. Must have been caught in a trap that was baited with oats. It's got oats right there sticking out. You can actually get your pinky in there and bury your pinky all the way up to probably the second digit in these fur-lined cheek pouches. They're really big and stretchy. And they use this to store seeds as they're running around gathering food. So this external fur-lined cheek pouch, and this also has an external fur-lined cheek pouch. No one else has this, so no other mammals have this. So this is an example of a trait that we think evolved in the common ancestor of these two groups. And now the pocket gophers continue to have it, and these kangaroo rats continue to have it, right? But not because they each evolved it independently, but because it evolved in the ancestor of both of these lineages. An alternative to that is like the the marsupial mole and the placental mole, right? These live obviously one in throughout the North America and the other in Australia, and they have really similar traits. They both have short little stubby naked tails. They both have big forelimbs that are short but powerful. They both have reduced eyes and reduced ears, and they have special chemosensors here on their nose, and they have naked noses. Now, these traits, all of them, are shared, but not because the common ancestor of these animals had them, right? These marsupial moles are more closely related to kangaroos and opossums, and these are much more closely related to, for example, uh, kangaroo rats and pocket gophers. So these traits are analogous traits. Yes, they're shared, but not because their common ancestor evolved them, but because in each lineage independently, these traits evolved because they live in similar habitats. And so they have similar selective pressures or have had similar selective pressures. So this is tough. This is a challenge, homologous traits versus analogous traits. How do you determine whether what you're looking at is a homologous or analogous trait? And you have to make sure it's homologous or you can't use it to reconstruct evolutionary relationships. Otherwise, you'll be misled if it's an analogous trait, right? So um, the the mental concept we have, the construct is that we just find all the homologous traits or all the traits that we can, figure out which ones are homologous, and say, well, the animals that share the most homologous traits, they must be the most closely related to each other. And there's kind of three broad types of traits that we use for this. We can use what an animal looks like phenotype, or what an organism looks like. We can look at phenotype. This is also called morphology, right? Morph. Um, so phenotype, morphology, same thing. Um, Developmental sequence, like what organ systems are formed first as the animal develops, right? Which population of cells um, in the developing embryo give rise to a particular tissue or a particular organ? Um, what cells migrate? When do they migrate during development? What tissues do they create once they do migrate? And then there's genetic similarity, right? Just looking at how similar is the DNA sequence, where we say that, well, the more similar the DNA sequence, that must mean that organisms are more closely related to each other. We can look at other things too, like chromosome number, or where is the centromere on the chromosome. Those can also be super informative traits, right? Okay. Um, so I'm showing you this figure from the one of the only figures in The Origin of Species, that book that Darwin published so long ago, where this figure that he drew basically explains kind of two things: diversity of life and unity of life. So his this figure is down here at the bottom. This is like way, way back in the past. Up here at the top is now, right? Contemporary. And this tree that he's drawn here, this branching or bush-like tree, is where he's attempting to show that back here was some common ancestor, and it gave rise to a bunch of lineages of organisms. Many of those down here went extinct. A couple survived, and then themselves went on to branch into multiple lineages. And again, most of those went extinct, but some survived and continued to branch. And so this accounted also for all the fossils that we have, right, in our museums. Fossils of animals that are not alive, fossils of plants and fungi, and uh, uh, plankton and algae that are not alive today, right? Those are all these dead ends here, right? These are all the lineages that didn't survive to today. And then you have those here that did survive to today. These are contemporary animals here: A10, F10, M10, right? Whatever those are. So that's what he was trying to convey, that all life is unified. It started from one common ancestor, and then it diversified, it changed, it branched over time. All these splitting events represent changes, diversification. Um, and and then also that most organisms have gone extinct, and they haven't made it to today. So I think it's actually that we continue to use this concept, and we continue to draw these types of trees to represent evolutionary relationships between organisms. So here's the big thing. I just want to give you an example here. Darwin thought species diverge gradually, and so each one of these branches that we see here, he was thinking that there would be small changes uh, building up along each of these branches, right? And so he talked about two kinds of change: the change that occurs along these branches, along these lineages, that's called anagenesis, and then the changes that occur when a branch splits into multiple lineages, or one lineage, or sorry, two lineage, that's cladogenesis. So he thought about two types of change that could happen. And often now when we draw these trees, we actually put little tick marks along these branches to indicate anagenesis, to indicate the evolution of some trait, right? Gaining a fifth digit or something like that, gaining eyes. Um, and so we continue to do that, to put little tick marks on there. So let's just imagine here, our little red dots here representing species that are alive today. Here's a couple of species. This also shows us how this is fundamentally different from the naming scheme that Linnaeus gave us, or at least the concept that underlies that naming scheme, where he said everything in one is in a hierarchical level, right? one level below another. That's not how life is. Here's a kangaroo rat, here's a rabbit, right? If we trace backward in time, we see that back here is where they share an ancestor. This is their most recent common ancestor that diverged and eventually gave rise to both of these. Well, here's an elephant. Elephant on this at this little dot. Well, if we trace back, we see that the common ancestor between elephants and these other two is way back here, right? Way back there. So these two animals are more closely related to each other than either is to the elephant. And yet, if you look at Linnaean taxonomy, you'll see that each of these is in their own, the same hierarchical level, which is an order. Um, and so these are rodents, these are lagomorphs, and these are proboscidea, right? They each are in their own order. And yet that doesn't mean anything from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Because they're not equivalent, because actually these two are more closely related to each other than either of them is to this elephant. So this is where we see conflict with those two systems, but we're trying to reintroduce a better order by renaming things, reorganizing trees. So that what we just looked at was basically a cladogram. You can also think of it as a phylogenetic tree, but in either case, it is just a diagram and really a hypothesis that depicts the ancestor-descendant relationships or lineages. What are the relationships between lineages of organisms? So lineages of evolutionary descent. We can draw these trees for populations, for species, or even for larger groups like we just saw here, for orders of animals, right? Rodents, lagomorphs, and proboscideans. Okay. So why do we want to construct cladograms? Because it gives context to evolutionary history. In other words, when I talk to you about, oh, the rodents and the rabbits, right? You immediately, or sorry, when I talk to you about let me say that differently. When I talk to you about the hmm, vertebrates, you all know that I'm talking about, well, everything with a nerve cord that's surrounded by bony vertebrae. Hopefully you know that. Maybe not. That's okay too. Right? Or if I talk to you about the mammals, you know I'm talking about everything that has fur and feeds its lactates to feed its young and has two sets of teeth, right? Um, so I don't have to say all the organisms. I just have to say one word, one group, and you know who I'm talking about. So it's a very efficient way of classifying and of naming because you take care of both at the same time, the classification and the naming. And the classification actually means something about how closely related they are. And I'll just give you this example to wrap this up to show you how really all species do trace their ancestry backward to a common ancestor. We also call that coalescing, right? Coming together at one common ancestor in the past. So we're going to think about, I mean, you can draw this sort of a tree for genes or for species, but I'll do it for individuals and I'll just use myself as an example. But this is basically just like tracing a family tree, right? I mean, you can even think about your own family, right? Your generation is you and your siblings and all of your first cousins. That's one generation. And then you go back one generation, that's your parents and all your parents' siblings and their cousins. And then further back is your grandparents, right? And all their siblings and cousins. So let's just do a quick example of that to see how tracing these over time through generations, tracing individuals and the offspring they have is basically just going to give us an evolutionary tree. So here's a population at generation 0 back here, and let's say there's only 10 individuals in the population. Very small, right? Genetic drift has a large effect on populations like this. Here's the next generation. That would be the offspring of these. Here's the second generation, right? The second filial generation. That would be the offspring of the first filial generation, and on through 10 generations. Now let's imagine, because we know, right, that not every individual is going to reproduce themselves. Some are going to reproduce themselves. Some will produce two offspring. Some will produce three. Some will produce none. Some will produce four, right? I just at random, I put 10 numbers in a hat. I didn't do it. I actually used a random number generator program. But the idea is you have 10 numbers, crumple them up and put them in a hat, and you blindly pick one out, read it, write it down. This individual has one offspring. Put that back in the hat. Rummage around, pick another, whatever that number is. Okay, that individual also has an offspring. Put it back and continue to do that until you've got 10 offspring in the next generation. So in this example, in generation 0, this individual 1 had 2, individual 2 and 3 didn't have any, individuals 4 had 2, 5 had 3, and on. So here's my family. Here's my uncle Rick. We'll start with my parents' generation. My uncle Rick, no kids. There's my mom. Right? She had 2, my sister and I. Passed on 2 to the next generation, contributed 2 offspring to the next generation. There's my Aunt Pam. She had 3, right? So 3 to the next generation. And this is basically, then we just continue to carry this on. And oh, actually, I could do this now. So far, my sister, none, me, 2. And then my cousins, I could do those as well, right? Um, so let's do that. I just did that, completed the whole thing. Now let's look up here at the top. This is 10 generations from now, right? Up at the top. Well, let's see who from this generation produced offspring that lived to this 10th generation. And what we do is just color in every individual in this 10th generation and trace back, just trace the line back and see, oh, look at that. That's me, I think. Or that's my mom, right? That must be me. So, yeah. So I'm definitely going to leave offspring to 10 generations into the future. No, who knows? But you do that for all the offspring up here, right? And if you do, I mean, in this case, every single offspring or every single individual in this 10th generation actually traces its ancestry back to me, right? Back here in this generation. I don't know which one of my offspring this is, right? Or which one of my offspring this is, but we'll see. They both ended up contributing to the final generation, so that's great. Um, but this is all that an evolutionary tree is. It's looking at all the individuals that are alive now and tracing back through the generations to see who gave rise to all those individuals, right? In somewhere back in the past. So it's an unavoidable consequence of the birth death process and the um, asymmetric reproductive success that we know is basically a fact for all populations, right? All populations have asymmetric reproductive success. So now let's wipe out those. Let's take away all these circles that don't have a branching point there, right? These are just straight lines now. So we'll color in the ones where there's coalescence, where there's the coming together of 2 or more lineages. We'll get rid of those. And there we have a cladogram, an evolutionary tree, right? That's all this is. And like all evolutionary trees, it has tips. Those are the species or organisms that are alive today. It has branches, right? These are just the lineages along that are evolving and along which mutations appear. We have nodes back here. Nodes are also called common ancestors, right? This is the common ancestor of this individual and that individual, right? In fact, it's the most recent in the past, back in the past, common ancestor of this individual and this individual. This is also a common ancestor. It's not the most recent common ancestor of this individual and this individual, but it is a common ancestor of those. Right, so all nodes are common ancestors. They might be most recent common ancestors like this one, most recent common ancestor of these 2 individuals. Move that out of the way. or it might be just an ancestor. Oops. Oh, and then we have this root. This is just the root of the tree, right? Okay. In Okay, so in our next video, hmm, we will look at reading these trees and talk about how do we read these trees? How do we talk about these individuals or these tips, these taxa at the end of the trees? How do we talk about how one is related to the other? Um, what's the vocabulary we use to do that? Okay. Please let me know if you have questions about this, and I will see you again in our future recording.